Hello, beautiful people. Welcome to this week's episode of the Montpelier Happy Hour here on WVEW 107.7 LP Brattleboro, the community radio station. I'm your host and producer of the show, Olga Peters, and this is where we talk about how everything in Montpelier shakes out for the rest of us. And hey, regular contributor, Emilie Kornheiser, so glad you're here.
Hi, Olga. So glad to be here.
And yeah, today you're here as, yes, Representative Emilie Kornheiser, but also incumbent Emilie Kornheiser, who is running in the state primary to represent Windham 7. And your opponent is Amanda Ellis Thurber, who was on the show last week. So I'm excited to talk about campaign because you and I often talk about policies and issues, but we're not necessarily talking about campaigns and knocking on doors and that sort of thing. So I'm excited to hear how your campaign is going this season.
I'm excited to talk about it because I know, I ran for office because I'm a policy geek and I wanted to sort of make a difference in policies that would improve the lives of folks down here in Brattleboro. Um, but campaigning sort of separate from politics for me.
Hmm.
Um, Campaigning for me is like when we get to have some of the conversations that help shape policy. It's the time when like I knock on doors and I get to hear about what's working for people and what's not working for people. It's like the time when I'm able to the most comprehensively really like draw people's voices into the political process, into the policy process, so that if and when I am elected and I'm sitting in committee making decisions, I can remember the person that I was talking to yesterday about, their challenges getting dental care, right?
Mm-hmm. Thank you. I just want to take a quick moment to apologize to listeners and to Emilie. There is some road work happening near where I'm sitting, and so you may hear some traffic noises and some people calling and yelling at each other and that type of thing. So I apologize for that. I hope it's not too distracting.
I haven't heard
Now,
any
oh, you
today.
haven't? Okay, good, good. Um, I'm curious. You've run before, so this
Mhm.
isn't your first door knocking, but it's the first time you're running in a contested primary against another Democrat. And I'm wondering, is it changing how you're proceeding? Is it changing what you're listening for? Has it changed some of the conversations that you're having with people?
Um, well, my first race was a contested primary as
Mhm.
well. And I have had a contested election every time I've run.
Right.
And when I knock on doors, and the Speaker of the House came down to knock on doors with me, and she is like a few days ago, and she is like a campaigner. Like she
Yeah.
moved to Vermont first time to work for the party. She's been a field organizer. She's like very like she has I don't know if I've ever seen her as happy as she was knocking on doors with me. She just like loves it. Um, and I do not follow the vast majority of the best practices. And so I was like,
Oh,
oh,
really?
yes. And I was like, oh God, she's seeing all my what she would imagine. I imagine she would think we're like bad campaign habits. Um, and one of those is that I knock on every door. I don't just knock on likely to vote in the Democratic primary door, which is what is sort of considered the best practice to win.
Yeah, but when
And
you're representing a whole district that includes more than Dems, I can see why you'd want to knock on every door.
yeah, I want to know like, and I do it, I don't like sort of kick off with like, here's what I've gotten done, please vote for me. I really just try to like have a conversation that allows people to tell me what their life is like and what it might take to make their life feel a little bit easier or have a little
Mhm.
more ease. And so I'm there to listen and learn and to try to make, to have the information I need to go do a good job on the other side of this. I'm not, I'm like doing it almost like more as a researcher. than as a campaigner, though occasionally, like my favorite is when I meet someone who's like, oh, I'm not that into that politics stuff. And sometimes like if it's the right kind of person, I'm like, well, the politics is into you. So let's talk about like what I've been able to do as a person who's like lived a regular life down here, and is able to bring that voice to Montpelier. So yeah, no, I guess I'm not doing it all that differently, though there's like a more anxiety attached to all of it than there might be otherwise.
Hmm. Are you hearing different things or new issues coming up from folks when you're talking to them?
Um, a few folks have, like a few very specific folks have had questions about the Overdose Prevention Center. Um, Way more legislation, way more folks have just had concerns about opioids in town. Sort of the vibe of downtown is definitely something that we talk about. Safety. Every neighborhood has like its particular thing. There's like the one problematic neighbor, or some neighborhoods are much more interested in property taxes than others. A lot of people, most people still want to talk about healthcare. That was true my first time around, and that's still true.
Hmm. And when it comes to healthcare, has the questions, the issues, whatever, have they evolved at all, or is it still feeling like they're saying the same things about healthcare that you heard when you first started?
So when I first ran, I heard what people said and was like, I'm gonna go and fix this.
Surprise.
My ambitious young political self. And that was, that was 7 years ago. And so it was much closer to the very close attempt by the Shumlin administration to move to single payer, right?
Hmm.
Um, and so people had like slightly different language for it. Um, but it was basically like healthcare's, the message was healthcare is too expensive. Um, and I can't live like this. And that's still the message. Um, More folks this time are talking about like hoops they have to jump through, or an inability to get medications, than
Hmm.
I heard 6 years ago.
Any, oh, sorry, finish what you're going to say.
Well, and I have a more nuanced view of the issue, and so it might be that I'm just hearing things with like a better ability to sort of scaffold the stories people are telling me.
Mhm.
It's also really exciting because this time, for the first time, I actually think we have been able to get something done on healthcare in a really significant way. And so that feels great, to be able to, I was talking to someone the other day who, the insurance company didn't approve the type of insulin they've been on for like most of their life, and wanted
Hmm.
them to have a different kind of insulin. And so they did. And this was the insurance company making the decision, not the doctor. It was sort of a prior approval issue. And they wound up in the hospital because it was the wrong insulin for them. And then
Right.
now they're back on sort of their original because the insurance company saw that they were harmed by that other one, and so allowed them to go back, right?
But they had to
And
get harmed first.
yeah, and so that's actually like something that we made like major regulatory reforms in this year. And so that if like the law gets followed right, that actually shouldn't happen again. And so I don't, it's this work is, like slow and systematic and frustrating. And so when I'm actually talking to someone and can see real policy differences from people's stories, it's really heartening.
Hmm. I'm curious about medication because it's been a topic around healthcare, it seems, in the past few years more than previously. Are you hearing a theme on types of medication people are struggling with, or is it uh, the type, doctor prescribed one, like in the case of the insulins, doctor prescribed one, insurance company wanted a different one? Like, what's the theme around medications that's
Well, I mean, first of all, I'm like standing on someone's doorstep uninvited, and so I don't tend to get that personal with people, though
Mhm.
occasionally people will get that personal.
Volunteer.
Yes.
Yep.
Um, it tends to just be sort of the cost or the struggle to get it, one or the
Okay.
other. Yeah. And then a lot about people sort of getting kicked on and off Medicaid and not being able to afford whatever the next step is.
Hmm. So like a benefits cliff kind of
Benefits cliff,
situation.
which is something that we passed a really significant change in that out of the House this year. And the Senate wasn't able to pass it out, but hopeful for that next year.
Hmm. Thank you. One thing that I've been thinking about with this campaign
Mhm.
particular or this primary coming up, because I like primaries more than the elections in some ways, because like I said, I feel people have more power to make a choice.
Yeah.
And I think, you're one of three reps for Brattleboro,
Mhm.
and Tristan is stepping down, and you and Molly are the incumbents. And so we've seen more people come on the scene, like David and Ian and Amanda, than we perhaps had in previous primaries as far as Dems. Um, and one thing I find so fascinating about this situation is that in some ways you and Molly are known quantities. And so that's positive, but it's also negative, right? Because depending on what job people think you have done, right? And the newbies are unknown quantities, which of course is a positive or negative as well. Um, given some of the conversations that have been happening on the landscape and like the Dems forum we had at Brooks Library beginning of this month, what's it like to have that mix of institutional knowledge and newbies?
Um, I remember Jeanette White, who, God bless her, just says whatever comes into her head some days, right?
She does,
Um, and
which is why I happen to love her very much,
I
but
know,
yes.
me too. But like, as a colleague, it's definitely like a for better or for worse kind of situation. And she said something during some campaign event that was essentially like, I've been doing this, managed to piss everyone, like I've managed to piss everyone off.
I think I was
Um,
there for
and
that one,
I've
yeah.
like helped almost everyone, right? And I haven't been doing it quite long enough for that. Um, but I do have the sense that, like, as you're in public longer and longer, people tell more and more stories about you. Those stories get more momentum. The mystique grows, or, I cut someone off at an intersection once. Like I am still a person living in this community, like going to concerts, buying groceries. And in all of that, am considered still a public figure by people. And so that's sort of challenging to have that brought into the race.
Mm,
I think David and Ian have already had that experience to some degree. So voters who sort of follow the select board have some of that experience with, like, someone who didn't feel like David gave them a fair shake at the mic during town meeting,
right.
or folks who might be upset with things that the select board did under Ian's watch, right? Um, and so there's that piece. Whereas Amanda has been able to, like, she
Yeah,
sells
she's a
different.
complete newbie.
She's a complete newbie, and a
Yeah,
lot of people know her because she sells very delicious vegetables and the best creamies in the state, right? Um, and so that's like it's an interesting contrast there, because the work that I necessarily have to do in the legislature, like, there's no perfect, have mostly been handed some of the toughest problems of our time to solve. Um, And like, like lobbyists in the state house will be like, wow, you've really gotten a raw deal this year, Emily, about just like the packages of problems that were handed to me, right? That
Yeah.
I didn't necessarily like pick from the sky or like volunteer to solve. Um, and so
Right, but
there's,
they have to go through your committee of ways and means because taxes fund
yeah,
most
and
things.
I'm,
Yes.
and people trust me to be able to negotiate tough challenges like honestly and transparently and with good process. And most of those issues, there's no perfect solution to.
Mhm.
Um, at all. And change takes time and it's hard and it pisses people off. And, um, you know, I've been sort of struck to watch myself through this process and realize that like the accolades or the letters to the editor or the support that like means the most to me seems to be from the people who like disagree with me the most. And I find that
Mm.
so, um, I don't know, like interesting just about my own personality and like what that says about me and not like, it doesn't matter for the campaign. It's just sort of like, when Matt Coda, who's a fuel lobbyist, or this like GOP operative, or not Matt Coda, like this other guy who's
Yes. Yeah.
the operative, or even, David Scholes, who I've disagreed with like hundreds of times over the last 6 years. When they say that the way I sort of conduct myself in the building is really like a paragon of good process and transparency and collaboration, like that somehow means more to me.
Hmm.
Um, because they're sort of watching the most closely with the most critical eye in some ways,
This,
right?
yes. Yeah. No, I
It's
think
not
there is
just
something to be said there. Yeah.
yeah, it's not just that I did what they wanted. Um, I fear this is turning into a therapy session, Olga, but the last thing that I'll say is that I've been struck by the balance in the community of folks who I hear from who are like, you have gained a lot of power and that benefits Brattleboro.
Hmm.
And the folks who say, you've gained a lot of power, you must not care about us anymore. You must be focused on bigger and better things.
Oh, interesting.
And that's sort of like a therapy session for the community itself, right? Like I don't know what that says about each of those people who tend to have that attitude. But I will say I have no interest in running for governor or Congress or anything like that. If I wanted to run for state Senate, I would have done that, 2 cycles ago when the seats were open. I really love representing like these 4,000 people and these particular neighborhoods and doing the work that I'm doing the way that I'm doing it. So, yeah, I don't even remember what your original question is. Sorry.
Um, I think you did well. It was that, what's it like to have a mix of newbies and um, institutional knowledge? And I think I'm going to give that question just a little bit of a follow up with a twist to kind of refine it a little bit because you touched on it when you mentioned when you first ran, you said, "Oh, I'm going to fix healthcare."
Oh,
And
yeah.
I think that's one of the luxuries the newbies have is anything's possible.
Hmm.
Where for like you and Molly and Tristan, who's in the, won't be running again, you have seen things succeed, you've seen them fail, you've seen them take so many years that you're like, I don't know about you, but there's been some issues that I've reported on that I'm like, wait a minute, has this passed yet? We've been talking. Oh, and I have to go look up to make sure it has or has not passed because we've been talking about it for so long. I can no longer remember. Um, and so I guess that's would be where my refinement is what's it like sitting with people who are still in that we can do anything energy from a place where that it's not always the case.
It's really hard. It's really hard. It's really hard. It's also really hard to not be arrogant about it. And as a woman, I feel like my affect is particularly monitored in this race, right?
Mhm.
Um, and in the forum, even, I was like, how come they get 4 minutes and I get 4 minutes when they can just say it's a problem? And I'm like, here are the 80,000 angles of the problem, and here are the 80,000 angles of the solution. And like, I'm so sorry that I could write like a whole thesis about like captive insurance sandbox policy, which is something most people have never even heard of. Like, I I heard some journalists, I did this great journalism panel when I was directing Governor's Institute
Mhm.
last week. And one of the journalists said, like, legislators get like multiple master's degrees in topics every year, right?
Mhm.
And it really does, it feels like that. Like there's a depth of complexity to every single issue that needs new eyes on it, right? Like that's the whole theme of our show here, right?
Yeah.
Like on the happy hour, when I was first elected, you and I were like, let's unpack the stories behind what happens.
Mhm.
And both really understood that a lot of the reason that things don't happen is because people get stuck in their stories.
Yeah.
And so it's
Yep.
really helpful to have fresh eyes on a problem and for someone to be like, this is a problem. Because other people are like, the problem is receded to the background because they've given up on solving it, right?
Mhm.
But it is hard when people sort of, what's hard about it is when I'm blamed for a problem that I've been busting my butt to solve and is still a problem. And
Right.
because I have taken the risk, the political risk, the personal risk of naming it and trying to solve it, somehow I am now responsible for it, rather than
Mhm.
it being like 40 years in the making and, America in 2024.
Right. Right. Yeah, I that is a interesting transformation that tends to happen
Mhm.
with um policy, that once you put your hand up to it, there's in the public mind, it very quickly becomes yours,
Yeah.
for
And,
better or for worse.
it's interesting how much we're talking about Jeanette. I'm thinking about Jeanette in this conversation. But both David and Ian have been very, very articulate in their platforms about sort of the needs of the town specifically, as because
Mhm.
they're both have been select board members, and like very specific solutions. And those are solutions that Jeanette White worked on like the entire time she was in office. She was the chair of the Senate Government Operations Committee and like wanted more power for the towns, right? Like to get rid of Dillon's rule, like more resources for town, like, and maybe David or Ian will like be able to go up there and build on all that she did and all that legacy. I hope so, right?
Right. We shall see.
Mhm.
Um, you mentioned the stories that get told about you.
Mhm.
What are some of the stories you're hearing being told about you right now?
Oh, Olga, look, for folks who are not on the video, I'm like blushing from that question. Flushing. I don't know if I'm blushing or flushing. I feel red about that question.
You don't look red.
Um, the what are the stories being told about me? That I'm like a vigilante or a warrior or like a righteous social justice, whatever, who doesn't listen to people. That
Hmm.
one's really hard for me.
Okay.
Because I think one of the things that I actually wonder about myself sometimes is like when I am in the state house, um, I sometimes have an excess of an ability to hear both sides of a problem.
Mm,
So
mhm,
that I can convince myself of almost anything. I'm gonna just like a so I was really uncomfortable with our caucus's debate about banning flavored tobacco.
mhm,
Um, I think that like there's one conversation around vapes in schools and kids, and I think
mhm,
that's very different from like adults and menthol cigarettes. And
mm,
the two
mhm,
issues were being conflated. And I really feel that like most people who smoke like have enough going on in their lives. They don't need me bugging them about it.
mhm,
Um, and was really like I did a lot to be like I don't, to try to avoid voting on it, like to try to avoid it coming to the caucus as an issue. I managed to like punt it out a year with some colleagues, like and then it became a big bargaining chip between the House and Senate, and the House wound up moving forward on it. And I you know, kept on like really pushing back on it and the menthol cigarette part particularly. Um, and then, like I heard from folks at the NAACP that they supported it. And I started to be able to think of it as sort of like a regulatory control and not like a consumer protection issue and not like a nanny state, tax on the poor. So I don't know. I think I'm more patient than a warrior usually is. And I'm
Mm,
very, very interested in who gets left behind and what gets left behind when we make the decisions that we do.
mhm. Is that the only story you've been hearing?
Um, there's like weird stuff that's just like things that people say I voted for that I didn't vote for that I don't even like know how to unpack, that I'm just like, does someone believe that? It's pretty easy to figure out what I voted for. It's all online. Are
Mhm.
people lying on purpose? I don't know. I get sort of more lost in people's motivations around stuff like that
Mm,
than the actual content. Um, I talked to another reporter today, Ann Wallace Allen, who's doing an article about this primary, which I
mhm,
feel a little confused why anyone, 7 days is mostly like Burlington area folks. Um, and she said that she heard someone actually like called her to tell her that I rent the house I'm living in from my father who owns it, which is just like not true. Like there's no universe where that's even close to true. I can't imagine where anyone got that idea. My father doesn't own any property in Vermont at all. My father, in fact, owns no property. He moved here in the fall and rents an apartment downtown. Um, I
mm,
rent from some lovely people named Michael and Michelle who have goats, who I am not in any way related to and really only know as neighbors. Um, and they've come to become friends. But
mhm,
yeah, I just like, where does this stuff come from?
mhm. Well, I think unfortunately with politics in general, we're always looking for the conspiracy.
Oh.
Like, oh, they vote this way because they're really blah blah,
Mhm.
is like the fill in the blanks.
Yeah.
Um, we have to go to break, but I appreciate you sharing some of those stories because I think I'm not sure we can ever talk too much about how we are story building creatures, us as human beings, but sometimes we build them around things, going back to the premise of the show, and get stuck in them. And we
Yeah.
no longer see the forest from the trees. So I appreciate you just sharing some of those stories with us.
I mean, the thing that's wild to me about it all is like I am a straightforward person to a fault, right? And a friend of mine was telling me about some conversation they had with someone who said I had lied, and my friend was like, "She'd probably benefit from lying a bit more." Like, and so like, for better or for worse, again, I I put my cards on the table and I am an open book. And so anyone who wants to like ask me anything about myself and my financial situation and my personal life and why I believe the things I believe, like I think it's why, I wind up with so much media coverage is because reporters know that I'll just like answer the question.
Mhm,
Um, and so the idea that there would be falsehoods about me when it's so easy to find out the truth feels really confusing because there's so many good reasons to disagree with me.
mm. I love that you just said that. That's funny. Okay. On that note, we have to hear from some underwriters here on WVEW 107.7 LP Brattleboro, your community radio station. But hang tight. Emily and I will be right back. Welcome back to the second half of the Montpelier Happy Hour here on WVEW 107.7 LP Brattleboro, your community radio station. If you're just joining us, I'm the host and producer of the show, Olga Peters, and I'm speaking with regular contributor Emilie Kornheiser, one of three reps from Brattleboro. We're talking about the upcoming primary on August 13th, unless you've already gotten your ballot to cast a ballot early. And before we dive into everything, don't want to forget, thank you, BCTV, for taking the video version of our show and sharing it with stations around Vermont. And Emily, what do we need to remind listeners of?
The views and opinions expressed here are those of the host and guests, respectively, not the station, nor platform, nor friends, family, or employer.
Why, thank you.
You're
And
welcome.
we should also remind people in case they have forgotten, I know we've said it on the show already. However, for this primary, your ballots will not be automatically mailed to you. So if you want to vote by mail or vote early, or even just have your ballot and bring it with you to the polling place on the day of the primary, you will have to contact your town clerk and specifically ask for a ballot. Am I forgetting anything around that, Emily?
No, but you can either contact the town clerk or you can go to myvermontvoter.gov and request it online.
Mhm.
Um, would remind folks that while they need to be back in the town clerk's hands by August 13th. So we have 2.5 weeks until the primary date.
Mhm.
So if that is your plan, please do it soon.
Yes. Because the town clerks are fine if it's the polls close at 7 p.m. If you come running through the door at 6:50 p.m., ballot in hand, they will happily run it through the system for you.
Absolutely.
However, if your ballot arrives in the mail on August 14th, to the town's clerk's office, it unfortunately cannot be counted. So it really must hit that 7 p.m. August 13th deadline.
Now that we're saying it, I'm all of a sudden questioning if there's actually a postmark question. So
Oh, that's a good one. Yeah.
maybe I might take back some of that sentence and
I
just,
think for the safety's sake, though, folks,
yes.
if you're going to mail it, make sure it will be mailed in time to hit
Mhm.
August 13th and just
Okay.
be safe. So, Emily, if you are reelected,
Hmm.
will you continue your work on tax policy?
Well, if I'm reelected, I um, am under fairly confirmed assumptions that I would become the chair of Ways and Means again. And so would absolutely continue to be focused on fair tax policy. First off, whether I wanted to or not, and I certainly want to, we would be spending a lot of time focused on education tax policy.
Mm-hmm.
And really making sure that we have an education system that that both works for kids and families and teachers and that folks can afford. So that would be a big part of whatever lift is there next biennium. And actually probably work that I will be doing this fall when the primary is over. Whether I am reelected or not, I'm still going to need to be doing that work this fall. And
Mm-hmm.
then as part of the summer commission.
Oh, right.
And a lot of what I talk to folks about at their doors, what we've talked about, what's come up in the forums from all candidates is, a need to make sure that older Vermonters have their needs met, a need to lower healthcare costs, increase options for substance use recovery, residences, housing, all those things. All of those um, things cost money.
Mm.
Um, they require some policy reform, but the most part is actually just like a straight resource issue. And so we'll need to really continue to look at our tax structure to make sure that we can meet Vermonters' needs in a way that is fair and equitable.
Mm-hmm.
So yes, I will be going back to do that. We'll also do probably another run at family medical leave insurance.
Okay. Is there any other policy that's sort of hanging out there that you're hoping to dig back into?
Whew. Let's see. There's, a lot of that will depend on who becomes president, honestly, Olga.
Yeah.
Um, there's some really, really interesting podcasts about sort of the economic prospects in each case.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and I will be chair of the Joint Fiscal Committee if I'm reelected, in addition to being chair of Ways and Means. And so there'll be a lot of work to really monitor the strength of the state's bottom line,
Mm-hmm.
to work with the administration on that and Treasurer Pichek on that. And so, yeah, very geeky, very important.
Mm-hmm. So I'd love to share a little bit of feedback I received after the forum
Oh,
that
fun.
we did at Brooks Library, and it's policy questions that people came to me with. And I'll just call these the grocery store questions. You know, I happen to be doing something else and someone's like, "Oh, I saw that, what is it, blah, blah, blah." And so I got this question from a few people, and hopefully I will do them justice as I ask it. And it was about education taxes. And as we know, not all towns, but multiple towns will be seeing pretty big increases
Mhm.
in their education taxes. And we talked about that at the forum. And when it came to you and you talked about it, you did, if I'm paraphrasing correctly, if I'm remembering correctly, your answer was along the lines of, yes, this is hard and it's unacceptable. We're still working on it. Summer commission, da da da. Um, and you gave some explanations, and the folks felt that they're like, we don't understand this. We feel like the state itself doesn't understand how education taxes work. And how can the state not do that? Like, why is it not a simpler equation? Like, is the state just kind of running willy-nilly with scissors all over the place when it comes to education spending, was kind of their question. Could you sort of address that? I mean,
Yeah.
I know our ed system is complicated, but I suspect someone understands it somewhere.
Um, I remember the first time I had one of those conversations in one of those grocery store conversations, and it was someone had watched something that I did on public access, and I remember I was like buying yogurt. Like I remember the yogurt, I was like pulling the yogurt out of the cooler. And I just being like shocked that anyone would take the time to listen to anything I had to say. Um, yeah, so in some ways, because of this system of local control and balanced by sort of taxpayer equity that our entire education system is built on, in some ways, no one has full visibility on the system. I would say
Uh,
there's a lot of people who understand the system somewhat fully, but full visibility on that is not necessarily there because the budgets and the budget decisions happen at the local level.
mhm,
And there's been a long and somewhat absurdly contentious process around how the intricacies of district budgets get reported to the Agency of Education because, and this is true in a lot of areas in Vermont government, the local districts, or this is also true for municipalities, might use different software programs
mhm.
than each other. And so it's really hard to report up that data. And that data often is on a delay, and it's not, doesn't have a lot of integrity, not because the person doing the fiscal work doesn't have integrity as a human, just because data sometimes gets messed up in translation. And people code. This is like the most boring answer. I'm so sorry for anyone who's listening to this. I don't know how to make it more interesting.
They're wonky, geeky folks. So at least the folks who asked me will be very happy for the geeky answers.
So, throughout the session, I kept on hauling in this poor, lovely woman named Nicole Lee, who was fairly new to Agency of Education and the data person for the Agency of Education, and being like, why can't you tell me what people are spending this money on? This is bonkers. Um, And as we got sort of further into it, it's, like different finance directors code something differently from each other, which is
Mhm.
like, that's basically what I studied in my master's program is like, statistics, and like coding integrity is really important. And, when I do paid work, so I have a paid work project where I'm like analyzing a bunch of qualitative data with someone else. And we coded 5 of the same documents separately and then compared the coding on our 5 documents in order to make sure we were on the same page with how we were coding.
Mm.
We have more than 100 school districts in Vermont, right? And so how, like, do all of the fiscal, like, so the Agency of Education has been profoundly under-resourced, understaffed, and under-led for a very long
Mm,
time. We've talked before on the show on how the legislature's ability to hold the administration accountable is quite limited if they are actually fulfilling the law, just not doing it well.
mhm,
Um, it's not an individual. I mean, it might be the governor's fault, but it's certainly not like the individual poor human working at the Agency of Education's fault that they are under-resourced. And so all that to say, we don't actually have a precise view of how each district is spending money. We
mhm,
do know that the increase in spending, was roughly attributable to about 5 different categories that were roughly attributable because we sent out a very specific data request that I drafted with this woman, Nicole,
mm,
to ask all of the folks at all the districts to answer these questions, just so we could get an answer for the sake of policymaking this year.
okay.
There is no system in place to understand this.
Hmm,
We need a system in place to understand this. We added a position at AOE to work with Nicole to be really having eyes on for policymaking. So it's attributable to 5 things. The cost drivers related to those 5 inflationary pressures have their own, systems behind them, right? So one of them is healthcare costs,
mm, mhm,
right? The complexity of why our healthcare costs are going up is significant. There's a real, healthcare costs are negotiated, are union negotiations, but at the statewide level instead of the district level. When it was first made a decision to do that, everyone thought doing that would actually lower costs. This was before my time in the legislature. It has not, has resulted in increased costs. It would take there's no one true answer to why that is true, right?
mhm,
And every one of those categories that is true for. Um, the one thing that's like absolutely true is that federal money is down.
mhm,
But the
mhm,
solution for that is, a Congress that is unable to get most things done, right? Despite lots of goodwill on the part of our congressional delegation.
mhm,
Um, so I think there are a lot of people, not a lot of people, there are people who understand what's going on for the most part. I like to think of myself as one of them, and I think other people consider me one of them. But the solutions to do something about that are unbelievably complex and likely there is not consensus on any of them.
hmm.
And by
Interesting.
consensus, I mean even a majority to agree on any of them.
Mhm. The summer commission that was mentioned, do you think that will have some capacity to make some changes or to at least try to get people on the same page?
I think it'll have some capacity to put a proposal on the table,
Mm,
which
mhm,
is actually quite hard to do during the legislative session.
right.
Um, I hope that there's something near consensus. But one of the challenges with any reform, especially in education finance, is there's always districts that do better and districts that do worse under any proposal.
Mhm,
And legislators are generally feel obligated to vote for what's best for their district and not best for the state as a whole.
fair enough. For better or for worse, but fair enough.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, thank you for that explanation, Emily. And to bring it back to the campaign, you just did that short deep dive into very geeky policy. And I guess the question is, eh, you know, the job is underpaid, takes much more time than just those few months that you're up in Montpelier. Why do you keep coming back to it?
Oh, that's a good question. So many different reasons. Part of it is I love it. Like I love like very personally, I love learning new things every day. I love like unpacking unbelievably complex problems. I love seeing people with very different goals come together around a single solution. That's like, my flow zone. I love meetings. I find defeating bureaucracy to be one of the most satisfying things that I can do, right? Like I've, worked around government most of my life, and so have found ways to stay positive through a system that I think is mostly meant to dishearten us. Um, so that's one. Two, I feel really deeply that what I'm doing is improving the lives of folks in my community. And, every time I knock on doors, every time I talk to people, every time we have a forum and I hear, or I go to a select board meeting and I, hear both what's possible and what people are struggling with, I want to be of use. There's that great Marge Piercy poem. I don't know if you've ever read it, Olga.
Long time ago, but yes, you've mentioned
Um,
it.
I I think we all have very specific things to contribute in this life, um, towards, some vision of a thriving humanity. And I think this is where my skills are most of use. And so And then in like the very sort of like shorter term, I'm now like sort of a necessary part of a functioning legislature, with the positions that I hold. There isn't, I work really hard to mentor new members, but there is not someone who's sort of like likely and prepared to step into my shoes. It
Mhm,
would be very disruptive to getting things done, like education finance reform, if I was not reelected.
mhm. Oh, interesting.
Mhm.
Um,
Like even if I didn't want to run again, there would be a lot of like it would be irresponsible to the state of Vermont for me not to run again, even if I didn't want to, until I have someone really like lined up to step into the roles I've been in.
mhm. And that's around the tax policy and the education
Mhm.
taxes and um, the work around the summer committee that we've mentioned and that type of
Yeah.
thing. Okay. Well, I think that brings me, we talked in the first half of the show. You shared some of the stories you've heard. People have told about you, and I appreciate that because, like I said, we do like to focus on where we're getting stuck in our stories and what
Mhm.
stories we are telling on this show. And I think one of the stories I hear from folks is not necessarily always directly about you, but their fear around taxes, their fear around the economy, whether they're going to be able to pay their bills, whether they can afford to stay in Vermont. And right now, the education taxes and some of what's happening at the state level around tax policy, even the surcharge or wealth tax that was talked about this year, is very scary for a lot of people. It's really, when you're walking the plank on your finances, any little change can feel really scary. And for a lot of people, I think that has come to your feet and been
Mhm.
rested at your feet, whether that's fair or not. Um, but they are scared that you are not business friendly enough, that you just want to tax everybody left, right, and center. What can you I do think those fears need to be heard, and how can you respond to them? Like, what information or thoughts can you share with folks who are feeling very scared right now?
Yeah. One of the challenges about politics is that when people are scared, it's really hard to talk about complexity or nuance, right? It's really hard to hear it.
Mhm,
Like I know that for myself when I'm scared. Um, when folks talk about me not being business friendly, 2 years ago, I got an award from the Chamber of Commerce. This last session, I got award Legislator of the Year from VBSR, Vermont Businesses for Social Responsibility. 2 years ago, we passed a huge amount of corporate tax reform policies that um, included, changes in way sales taxes levied on manufacturing businesses, a whole bunch of changes in corporate tax. And in all of that, that was designed around making it easier for Vermont businesses to make it work. And that was work that I led on and that I reported on the floor, that I explained in its full wild complexity. Um, when we talk about tax burdens on working people, I don't know if there are a few people in the state house that have worked harder to lower tax burdens on working people. But, tax policy is complicated. Like anyone who's tried to file their taxes by hand, like it's complicated. There are percentages added here and other percentages taken out of here, and this tax credit there and that tax credit there. And at the end of the day, it's hard to tell like what is federal and what is state and how does it all work? For everyone. And so it's really important to me to be talking to people individually about their individual tax responsibility and um, not to get sucked into the headlines. I had one constituent write to me and say, like, I really hope that someday I make enough money to be paying this, surcharge for folks who make more than $500,000 a year. But for anyone making less than that, I've really done, a huge amount of work to lower taxes. And I think that we're doing that work. I'm doing that work in the face of 50 years practically of, neoliberal policies across the Democrat Republican divide and trickle down economics that have really profoundly damaged the middle class in America and in Vermont specifically. And so it's going to take a lot to change that. And I'm not entirely sure we can do it all just within our lovely state of Vermont, but I'm going to do my best to do that because I do this work because I think when we have some degree of economic freedom and economic stability, we're able to show up for our community better. And I believe, before we started the show, Olga, we were talking about how easy it is to get to doom and gloom about the economy in Brattleboro, Windham County, and sort of the state of things. And I just can see so clearly so many people who can see another way we could be together, can see all that's beautiful in our downtown and all that's possible in our downtown, and for each of us. And so I hold that vision. That's why I run for office. That's why I do the tax reform work I do. I think this is a tiny state and it is possible for most of us to thrive here.
Thank you, Emily. We have just about 5 minutes left before the end of the show. What do you want to leave listeners with? What is it, for the new candidates like Ian and Gartenstein and Amanda, I've asked them, what do you want people to know about you? I don't know if that's the appropriate one, or what do you want to tell them?
As I think we said earlier in the show, I'm an open book. I really encourage people, if you have a question, if you're mad about something that you think I've done or a policy that you've seen, please be in touch. Let's talk about it. I can only do this job when I hear from you. And our community tells stories about what will hurt us and what will help us. And I think we need to unpack those stories and talk about them together.
Mm-hmm. And if I have one more question before my final one. I was just thinking, we've talked a lot about tax policies, and those have certainly been, since you're the chair of Ways and Means, really been the water you've been swimming in lately. But what policy outside of taxes really holds your interest and passion as well?
There's two areas. One is, I was a commissioner on the Commission on Women before I ran for office,
Mm-hmm.
and I've been just really proud, particularly this year, in all that we've been able to get done in Vermont, for women's rights in the workplace, for women's dominion over their own bodies. That's really important to me. And some of that, like, again, is sort of like deep in the weeds of policy, but it's powerful and it makes a difference in people's lives in a very real way. So that's something I'm really passionate about. And then sort of like consumer protections, corporate policy. So things like the super fund for multinational oil companies, or banning toxic chemicals, or even just like much more straightforward consumer protection laws around cash apps. But just making sure that like Vermonters are protected from sort of like the ravages of the global marketplace. That's pretty important to me.
Right. Well, if folks want to reach out to you and they have questions or concerns, how can they do that?
Oh, I have one more thing that's really important to me.
Oh,
Rights for
okay.
foster care. That's something I've actually done a lot of work on and I feel really excited about, and I don't really ever talk about because I just start crying.
And I'm
But
so sorry, the first part of your sentence got, at least in my ear, got garbled.
rights for youth in foster care, or youth as they exit foster care. That's like a spot that really holds my heart, and have been able to get a lot done there.
Mhm. Yeah, there was some work this year about people being able to access their records.
Mhm. Yeah. Yeah, that's incredible. The Office of a Child Advocate has been made a difference, and I think there's still a lot more to do.
Mhm. All right. So if
Mhm.
people have questions, how do they get a hold of you?
Folks can go to emiliekornheiser.org, and you'll find links to my phone number and my email and my social media. And, this podcast, this radio show, we have 6+ years of episodes. So if folks want to dive deep into almost any policy issue, there is something to hear in here.
Mm-hmm. Yes, definitely. And you can find the Montpelier Happy Hour every Friday at 2 on WVEW 107.7 LP Brattleboro, your community radio station, rebroadcasted on Wednesday morning. BCT, BCTV, of course, you can find the video version and wherever you subscribe to your podcasts. Have a great weekend, everybody. Take care.